Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with mysticgenmara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And I clicked one wrong thing and I have to reset some stuff, so sorry I'm a little bit late. Tonight is our ongoing series, Occult and Crochet, and we are going to do a two-parter on this one. This particular gentleman that I am going to discuss tonight is probably one of my favorite and most, to me, respected of the occultists that I have studied and practiced. They're based off of what they have taught. And I'm only going to do about half of his life today, and I'll explain why when we get to the end. Because he has... There's a lot more here than what meets the eye, and I'm literally just going to give you some brief introduction tonight, and then in 2 weeks when we do the next episode we will dive much deeper into more of his occult practices, so to speak. And the person that I'm going to talk about is one of the men who, in my opinion, saved the Golden Dawn as we know it today. And that gentleman is Israel Regardie. At the very beginning, which is the best place to start, I guess, Israel Regardie was born in November of 1907. And he was born in England. Or no, where am I at? I have the wrong notes. Yes, he was in England. Sorry. Interestingly, he was born as Francis Israel Regardie, or Regardie, and we'll find out why the name was changed later. Israel's father, Barnett Regardie, was a maker of cigarettes. That's all it says in all the information I can dig up. Interesting profession. Not really sure why they just left it at that. Anyway, his mother was Phoebe Perry, just a housewife. Nothing more was really said about her that I could find. But she's not our focus. She's just the person who blessedly brought Israel into the world. His parents were, and when I didn't know this until I started really digging into him, because when you read Regardie's work, there's no emphasis, there's no real reference to his background and how he got to where he was, because it doesn't really apply to how he got there, because his parents were Orthodox Jews, which was fine. Just when you read through some of his work, you're like, how does this play in? Because it doesn't line up, but there's a reason for that. They were immigrants from what we would call today Ukraine. During the early 1900s, when he was born, it was called, oh, my phonetics are horrible, Zhytomyr, Russia. So it was the southern part of Russia, but today it's part the Ukrainian area. I couldn't find an exact date for the name change, but they had left Russia, they'd come to England, but the name change occurred, interestingly enough, because one of Israel's older brothers had a spelling error when he was joining the British military. I can't quite figure out why, because it's an odd thing. Oh, there was a spelling error. The whole family changes their name. And that's what exactly happened, is there was an oopsie on the paperwork, and so the entire family decided that they liked Regardie better than Regardie, and there we go. Again, kind of an odd way of going through life. Anyway, in about 1921, give or take, a month or two, Israel and his family left England and came to the United States. They eventually would land in Washington, D.C., and his parents immediately went in search of an Orthodox Jewish tutor and began teaching Israel the Jewish language. This knowledge would become invaluable to him in his later journeys and studies. But learning the language, learning how to spell, learning how to say the words properly and the letters, because it's mostly consonants in the Jewish, in the Yiddish script. There we go. But he didn't stay with his more conservative religious family beliefs. Israel's rebellious teenage years, He straight up pushed back and rejected his entirety of the entirety of the Jewish faith that he was born into, going so far as to call his parents' beliefs, quote, a load of rubbish, unquote. That's a little intense considering he was only like 14, 15 when this went down. Like, straight up, I'm out of here, you people are crazy. But he didn't leave home, so he had to call it that but not get too hostile about it because he was, like I said, still living at home. He started his journey into the occult around this time, though, so he was exceptionally young by today's standards to be delving into this type of work. And one of the first books, according to his biographers and some of his other references, his personal references, was by somebody that I will cover later, and I have to do this one delicately because I'm not a fan, personally. And that is Helena Blavatsky. Blessedly, he did not stop with her research and continued to go deeper. Like I said, I'll go over her later. I'm gonna have to probably do all the research on her and then leave it alone for a few days and then go through and take out all of my anger because I'm not impressed with that woman at all. But that's just me. He read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita of the Hindus. He then buried himself into multiple Buddhist texts. The list was pretty decent, so I'm not going to repeat all those here. But he moved into deeper knowledge and greater wisdom through this time, whatever he could get his hands on. And it is said that he considered the Library of Congress in his teenage years his second home. He lived in D.C. Of course he went there. I would love to have seen... there's certain people that you just would love to hang out with, even though they were nerds, kind of concept, but he's definitely one because I kind of have that same nerdy thing, like how much knowledge can you gain, how much interest can you find, and this is where you get into the beginning of who he would become. Israel, though, even outside of his occult obsession, he was interested in art, and at one point, he wanted to become a painter. Okay. He went into art school in Philadelphia, and it was during his artistic explorations that he joined a familiar group, one that if you've watched my previous videos of the Golden Dawn founders, it's not going to be that surprising. He joined the group Societas Rosicruciana, but this time in America, not in Anglia. And this is where he kind of starts meeting up to the concept of the Golden Dawn. Didn't join it at this time that I could find. And this is where Israel would learn of the wickedest man alive, Aleister Crowley. Israel came across a book in his studies through the Society and in the Library of Congress called Book 4. Not a very big book. It's broken into like 3 parts. I have it, read it multiple times, and it was written by Crowley. And the focus of the first part of the book, which is what he would call Book 4, but it's Book 1 within Book 4. Crowley had a weird way of titling things, but it made sense to him. Numerology was huge. The topic was being discussed of yoga, something that he'd read about in some of his Hindu studies, so he was interested, like, what is this all about? And by the time he'd completed reading Book 4, Israel was so impressed by the topic and the man behind the topic, he immediately wrote to Crowley's publisher in London. Crowley didn't get around, because Crowley actually responded directly to him, which I thought was cool, but he didn't get around to doing it for almost a year. It was like 8 months later he finally got a letter sent back, and that could have been just as much the publisher's fault as Crowley's. Crowley was exceptionally busy during this time. Busy in interesting ways, which we'll talk about Crowley later, because again, that's going to be another exceptionally long one, because Regardie had a lot going on and did a lot, but his focus was pretty much one line, as far as like he had primarily the Golden Dawn, but he had some other forays, which we'll talk about in the next video. Crowley didn't have one of anything. He studied all of it, which is going to make his, when we talk about him, exceptionally intense. Anyway, over time, though, Israel would meet Crowley, in his representative anyway, in the States, by a man by the name of Karl Germer. Interesting name, sounds German. Israel bought the entirety of the Equinox at that time, which was around 10 volumes, and the Equinox was Crowley's publication. He wanted to originally do it every quarter, so there would have been 4 a year. It didn't quite work out that way, but I've read through a lot of the Equinox, because surprisingly high numbers of them still are around, and there's people who bound books about them. Like I said, we'll talk about it later. But it's fascinating. I could only imagine someone who didn't have a background in a lot of it, because how I ended up into learning about Crowley is I was already into a very specific vein of metaphysical studies, and then Crowley stuff popped up. I devoured that and Regardie kind of side by side. So to me, you almost had to have them together. But for someone like Regardie, who is just obsessively craving knowledge, to run across someone like Crowley and his work, especially during that time, that was so taboo and so controversial. Just because of the topic that Crowley was bringing forward to the public. He wasn't writing everything in secret. It was encoded to a point, but it was being published everywhere, so there's some fascination about that. Back to Regardie. We're talking about Israel. Through Israel's reading and studying of Crowley's work, he actually came to the discovery of ceremonial magic. Magic with a K, we're talking real magic, not illusionary magic. In the fall of 1928, Israel accepted an invitation to be Crowley's personal secretary. I mean, seriously? Give me a letter like that and see if I don't jump across the ocean like Regardie did, just to sit at the side of one of the most accomplished occultists of his time. Probably even today, there's only a few people who have done to the level that Crowley did, and he got to go and meet with this man, sit next to him, take notes, edit some of the randomness, because Crowley was notorious for just almost barfing out information, and Regardie was the one who recorded a fair amount of that during these few years. It really wasn't that long, though. That's the sad part. Interesting, though. Even though Israel had been studying all of these occult subjects, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Buddhist texts, Blavatsky's work, and Crowley, he couldn't just outright tell his parents that he was up and leaving the country, not just the city, the country, going back to Paris, France. He couldn't tell them the reason. So he straight up lied and told them he was going to study with a professional painter in Paris. Not exactly a fiction, but not true either. So, unfortunately, Israel didn't fully understand how Crowley worked. That wasn't something that benefited him immediately. Israel was expected, as all students were, of Crowley, and if you ever have picked up a book by Crowley, he is very caustic in how he comes across. On certain topics, he was very loud. I do not want followers who are sheep. If you can't stand side by side with the wolf, don't even open one of my books. I mean, Crowley was hostile about this. You want to understand, you want to gain knowledge, basically your pound of flesh has to be put up to gain said knowledge. And that's kind of what Israel ended up doing. He did a lot of taking down dictation. You know, secretaries did a lot more than just paperwork. He would run errands and he would, arrange for meetings and things like that. So he was kept fairly busy. And the only time that Crowley would advise, guide, teach, was if it's something that he truly could not overcome this next hurdle, or he would run headlong into a brick wall and be like, I just cannot see the next step. I don't understand this. This concept is beyond me, which in the long run benefited Regardie massively. Crowley knew what he was doing. If you're not willing to put the time in, don't bother. And so Israel put in massive amounts of time to being able to gain this knowledge, and he was rewarded eventually. Took him some time, but he was rewarded with work of Crowley. One of the main things that he did do was Israel was able to study everything that Crowley published. Sometimes before it was published because he was his secretary, but he was also able to read his private journals and the writings that were not published at that time. Some of them were just notes that Crowley had taken. But Israel was burying himself in understanding what all Crowley had experienced, because by this point, Crowley already had his reputation as the wickedest man. He already had been bragging about being the Beast 666 and working through some of his other stuff, so it was known who Crowley was. Israel was just like, to be honest with you, and I was researching some of the stuff, I was getting chills, because it's like I could not have imagined sitting there next to this mad genius and like basically almost living with him at one point, doing who knows what. Crowley was an amazingly powerful person. Anyway, sorry. Israel was encouraged to lose any and all inhibitions. It's not, at the time, it was an open secret. Everyone knew about it, no one talked about it. And today it's just part of who Crowley was. He would encourage his students to visit prostitutes if he felt that the student was too uptight, too straight-laced, too rigid, or restricted mentally. Break down those barriers. Well, kind of being a whore was a way to break down a lot of barriers because it opens you up to things. Not the best guy, and I will never defend everything that Crowley did, but he was a genius. And he actually pushed Israel into doing some of the prostitution thing as well, just going to them, not being one. And it did help him break through some barriers. Not always the best way, but it worked for him in that time. It was around this time of intensive study and work with Crowley that Israel took on a new title. A title, not a new name. He still went by Israel, or Francis, I think. But he took on the title of Frater NCHSH. I'm not even going to attempt to say that. It basically means Father of Serpent, or Father Serpent. He eventually would change it to Father Scorpio, which both are kind of an interesting choice of titles, because the snake version is the title of wisdom, but Scorpio is the water serpent. It's the water energy, water knowledge. So this fluid knowledge is what his metaphysical title was. You know, father of fluid knowledge, father of water, father of wisdom. Kind of impressive by just the choice of his names, but he wasn't that old. He was like 26, I believe. 24, 25, something like that. He was exceptionally young when all of this was going on. And to be able to practice, access, and grow in his spiritual journey in that time, at that age, in that time, was something that very few people did. What Crowley taught was something for the elitists, the people who had massive amounts of time and wealth, which meant the over 50 crowd, over 40 at least. But there were a few people, Israel was one of them, and Jack Parsons and people like that, who were younger and were very interested. Some people didn't have a lot and they lost everything by going after this knowledge. This kind of knowledge does not come easy and is not something you want to play with. I'm talking about these people to give you some history as to how we ended up where we are today in a lot of the metaphysical world. Israel and Crowley's one of their foundational things was you don't teach people who are not willing to learn. There are rules. There are strict rules. And if you don't understand the foundation, you're going to fail or worse. And the or worse was the part that has been lost on a lot of people today. Not everyone, don't get me wrong, but there are rules. And that's what Crowley was very adamant with what he did. And that actually did seep into Israel's work, which I'll go into a little bit more next week when you start to understand just how far Israel took this in his life. There's a lot there. Anyway, and so only about a year after he moved to Paris, Israel ended up in the hospital for a short period of time. The time frame wasn't exact, as far as like a couple of weeks, a month, whatever. But while he was there, his sister discovered who he was visiting and what those writings were. It wasn't painting. He was with Aleister Crowley. And to put it mildly, she was less than impressed. She contacted the French authorities over it and demanded that they look into this horrible person, Crowley, and basically get her brother back. Justified your sister, you care about your brother. Of course, Israel didn't have the paperwork to justify long-term residency because he'd been there for more than a vacation at this point. And so he was very swiftly kicked out of the country. He landed in Belgium, the city of Brussels, for a couple of weeks is what it looks like. And why he chose Belgium, I'm still kind of lost by that one. Anyway, and Crowley was ousted as well and was basically went home to England. Fine. While in Belgium, though, and I'm not sure how this all played in because I was trying to find the connections here, but it looks like when he went to Belgium, so did the woman that Crowley was in a relationship with. Go with Israel, not Crowley. Interesting. But oddly enough, this didn't really matter to Crowley, which, if you've read his work, he had really true love for one woman only. Beyond that, they were just sources of magic, and it was a way to generate magic. I'm not going into all that. So it was almost like the impression I got from the research that I was digging through is that she went with Israel to tutor him in some of the more exotic arts that Crowley was teaching. And there could have been something more friendship-wise, relationship-wise tied into that. They didn't really go into that in any of the research that I found. So, but by the fall of 1929, Israel had reconnected with Crowley and moved into England. But shortly thereafter, and like I almost feel bad for Israel at this point, because Crowley couldn't afford to keep him on as a secretary because the publishing house that Crowley was using to publish his works, it looks like it went bankrupt for a time, or at least lost a whole bunch of money, controversy, whatever, and all of Crowley's money flow in England dried up. So he could not keep Israel on as a personal secretary, being able to pay him anyway. And so he eventually moved back to the States. Not the best way, but whatever. What I found interesting, though, and I've always found this fascinating because of how they separated, for the rest of Israel's life, he would defend Crowley's magic and occult genius ferociously. He would ignore or downplay the more controversial aspects of Crowley. And I have to agree with Israel on this. Crowley did horrible things, but you can't deny in the occult and metaphysical world his genius and what he brought forward through that. Now, is this something that anybody can pick up? No, and even Regardie made that very clear. He's not someone casually to read. Never think for one moment that anything that Aleister Crowley wrote was for casual work. He was an extremely dedicated, extremely serious, and that made an impression on Israel, especially being that young, making that connection. There were ups and downs in their friendship, don't get me wrong, and Israel would never deny that, but he always defended his friend. Even with all of that, again, he would support him, he defended him. He actually wrote a book. I couldn't find it at the moment. If I do, I'll link it in the next video. Because he actually wrote a book defending Crowley's legacy, going over some of the more interesting, fun, and helpful, beneficial aspects of what Crowley had done. I think I can't find it at reference, or can't find it right at the moment, because it didn't do that well. People wanted to hate Crowley, so it doesn't really matter who you were. Later on in life, though, and I thought this was entertaining because I did know that he was a little bit testy about this, but I didn't realize to what extent it would occur, why it would bother him. People assumed frequently that Israel was one of Crowley's Thelemites, practicing the spirituality of Thelema. And that would annoy. That's one of the few things that I could find that actually annoyed Israel with Crowley. It was said that he would, if it was talked about where there was a table, he would pound the table and say he was a Golden Dawn man, not a Thelemite. He never talked bad about Thelema, but he was very adamant he was Golden Dawn, which is pretty interesting. So this is kind of where I'm going to cut this off, because we didn't get into the Golden Dawn, which really defines the rest of Israel's life. This was kind of the foundational, who he was, where he was born. His upbringing was nothing special, unfortunately, but he connected with an occultist who literally, and from my research anyway, altered Israel's trajectory in life. It was through this connection to Crowley that he started working with the Golden Dawn. It was this time period. The Society Rosicrucian in America had an aspect of it because it helped him develop some of the magical and mystical studies that he was after. But Crowley's the reason that he ended up in the Golden Dawn. And I really wanted to bring that aspect forward in this first part, giving you a little bit of his, what do you want to call it, mundane history, showing a little bit of how he got his start into the occult. And when we do the second part of this later on this month, we'll go over, I'm going to try to flesh it out so that it's more detailed. I will not do rituals. That's just not going to happen here. But we will go through a lot more, breaking down, maybe even doing like breakdowns of books as we go along, because he wrote ferociously after this point. Because of Crowley, he actually met another gentleman who encouraged and supported his writing, and this is where the ball really starts rolling. This is why Regardie became someone that we all would know today if you've ever followed anything in the occult. So I will end this one at this moment, because we haven't gotten into the literary part of everything, and we really haven't addressed his position in the Golden Dawn at this time. But now you understand where he was coming from. He studied with Crowley. He buried himself in Hinduism. He buried himself in Buddhism as much as you could. There wasn't a lot published about those at the time, but there were published works. And so he studied all of that. He has a background in Orthodox Judaism, so he has a knowledge of the written word of the Jewish and Hebrew people. And this is, I think, a good spot to pause, because we've got a foundation. We haven't jumped into the launching off point yet. Kind of like got the jets going. I don't know, I thought it was a good spot. Birth through the wickedest man in the world. There's a lot more to go over. There's some books linked in the description below if you're interested in any of that, because there are a few books. We'll go over them in a couple of weeks, because they're very, to me, some of the foundational beliefs and the foundations of what he talks about in his written work. Little preview here. Do not only apply to occult metaphysical practices. The Tree of Life describes multiple ceremonial and what you would call high magic practices, but it applies to how you live your life. It's not just about when you're in the ritual, it's how you carry yourself in the world. The Golden Dawn obviously is his greatest achievement to me, because it's literally the entirety of the Golden Dawn's rituals, and the book is massive. It's like 4 inches thick. It's huge. The middle pillar is really focusing on building that spiritual energy, but you can use that energy for all sorts of different healing practices. The Garden of Pomegranates goes through what this Tree of Life is, what the aspects of it are. It also gives in detail, and we'll talk about a little bit more about this, some meditating practices. Fascinating work. Be yourself. It's relaxation. You're really focusing on how to shut your body down so that you can enter these altered states, and you don't need other things to do it. He found ways to get the mind to alter on its own, which is fascinating again. And The Art of True Healing, I'm only partway through that book, but it's not just energy work, it's how to discover what health means. So, with that, I will go ahead and, like I said, cut this video off here. You can check out some of those books if you're interested. When we come back to do the part 2, I will go through a lot more details as to which of those books and what they all stand for. We'll go through the timeline of how he wrote them, the way they're listed for the moment down below. Where'd that paper go? There it is. Starting with the Tree of Life and then the Golden Dawn. Those are kind of the primers, if you will. You can, if you don't want to go and read that gigantic novel of a book, The Golden Dawn, the Tree of Life is where you want to start. I don't care what else you're going on. Tree of Life's number 1. Garden of Pomegranates and Middle Pillar are interchangeable. If you just want to learn about the spiritual aspect of it, the Middle Pillar is a good one to really start to build the foundation. But the Garden of Pomegranates is definitely one of the top 3. But to me, getting the foundation, the knowledge, the understanding of what is out there, which is what the Tree of Life is. So those are good foundations if you want to kind of get started with Regardie's work. But with that, we'll let you guys go, and we will meet back here in 2 weeks, which would be, I believe, the 18th of September, to bring this particular chapter to its conclusion. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff about Regardie that comes up. It's not what you expect. We'll just go there. Anyway, we'll hop off here. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like. Let me know any thoughts, ideas. Constructive criticism is awesome. I like to know how I can improve my streams. With that, I will let you guys go, and we will talk to you in a future video.